India's climate transition. I'm also thrilled to have on the panel my former colleague and dear friend Monish Mahokar, who is now with Arga Climate Investment Management. But prior to joining the asset management industry, Monish had an incredible and extremely successful career in the multilateral space, where Monish was vice president of a number of different functions in the International Finance Corporation, the private sector entity in the World Bank Group, the largest investor in emerging markets. And in IFC, Monish had the privilege to run a number of different functions, including treasury, budget, strategy. The list is very long, so I'm sure I'm leaving something out. And prior to that, enjoyed, as did Namita, a career not just at the Asian Development Bank, where Monish was before IFC, but also in commercial banking. So two fantastic panelists, but let's get to the issue that we are here to discuss. I'm starting with you, Namita. Please lay out for our viewers, what is the state of climate transition in India today? And as background, I'll just say, India is responsible for 7% of global emissions, home to about 18% of the world's global population. Obviously now a very, very key player in the world's attempt to reach the Paris Agreement. This has been brought home to all of us this year in the summer, where all of us across the world, whether in the Mediterranean, in the US, or in India, have been suffering from the impact of global boiling. Clearly an urgent issue. Where are we in India today? What do you see as opportunities?
Thank you very much, Anita, and I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for that introduction. You began by saying that, this is a policy kind of a dialogue. So I have really broken down my response into 2 or 3 parts, talking about, on the policy front or what India is looking at. I think the priorities are very clear. It will act on climate change while managing its economic growth steadily. So there is higher penetration of cleaner fuels in the energy mix, accelerated adoption of energy efficient technologies, the whole digitalization move that we are seeing, and there is, of course, improved material efficiency, among other things that India is doing. Now, if you look at the regulatory action, because I think anywhere across the globe, we've seen action on climate may have been started at individual or institutional levels, but I think regulatory mandates have really moved the needle. So India, way back, we had our Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme that the Ministry of Power came out with. That was way back in 2012. But I think that's now being aided with the whole green certificates that are being brought out, the carbon trading system that is looking to establish a kind of a framework. I think green hydrogen, which is a big thing on the agenda. And only yesterday, we heard about the green, the announcement of the green hydrogen standards by the government of India on the back of the National Green Hydrogen Mission that was established earlier in January 2022, which will, this kind of a standard will officially specify the maximum emission thresholds in the production of hydrogen. And I think what is important is it is bringing out a definition of green hydrogen. And I think that's the key. And then moving on to the market regulator like SEBI, which is bringing in regulations for the ESG rating providers, reporting, the RBI, the prime, regulator for banks, talking about climate risk, that banks need to look at, talking about, products or giving some kind of guidelines on products like green deposits, disclosure framework, scenario analysis. I think all this, and then finally the larger picture of the Indian taxonomy, which is in the pipeline. I think this is pushing the agenda for financial institutions. And then if you look at what's happening on the finance front, I think the sectoral action is also picking up pace. So, projects in renewable energy, electric mobility, that were maybe one-shot deals a decade ago when we all started financing it, are now becoming mainstream. And really, that's being accredited in a way, a kind of a transformational role in climate transition. Also, the opportunity, and IFC, you may recollect, had put out this $3.1 trillion, opportunity that India has. It was an IFC report, but that still stays, where there's so many climate-linked sectors which are serving as an opportunity for the Indian, banks to look at. Looking at that and the pressure on the FIs because of these kind of mandates that are coming out, I think the whole trajectory is changing to look at look at products at one level, financial products, and to look at sectors at another level and the match between them. And one of the examples is we recently, as a consortium of Octus ESG, Climate Bonds Initiative, and ODI, we launched this whole India initiative on climate risks and sustainable finance. And this is looking to engage in providing support to banks and the RBI to enable a system where financial institutions can work with their corporate clients to develop their transition plans, reduce emissions, and enhance resilience. And then actively look at investing in green or climate resilient activities. And I'm glad to say that there were many Indian banks present there. There were VCs present there, and RBI, more importantly, that was present there. So I think, what I'm trying to say here is the space has become very rife with these kind of products as well as opportunities. And I think as bankers, understanding the risks, understanding the technology risks, understanding, what's there in the near future, and how do we look at the normative approaches, I think all that is somehow coming together to bring about the transition. I'll stop here and over to you, and maybe come in a little later. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Namita. Monish, let me turn to you, because you have the benefit of both understanding the Indian context, but also a global perspective, both in your role in the multilateral world and now in an asset management role. From where you sit, how do you see the steps that India is taking, both on the policy front as well as on the private investment front, to meet net zero by 2070?
Yeah, thanks, Anita. And again, wonderful to be here together with you and Namita at this panel for the Kautilya School. And thanks for that very warm and kind introduction. So great to have this dialogue with you guys. So maybe, as you mentioned, or you asked me to shed some sort of a global perspective on this. So let's putting some numbers on the table to explain to our audience the scale of the challenge that we are talking about at a global level. And again, the point is not the specific, you don't need to recollect or recall the exact numbers, but more in terms of orders of magnitude and where are we, right, in terms of the scale. So just very simply put, many of you might be aware, the global annual emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which cause global warming, we are at about 51 billion tons per year, right? But for a very, kind of isolated dip that we saw in the COVID year, I think it was 2020, then emissions fell by about 5-6%. We are still continuing to see emissions grow by 3-5% every year from this 51 billion number. And the challenge is to get this number down to net zero, right? This 51 billion has to become zero by 2050. So you can imagine the scale that we are trying to achieve here. Namita mentioned some of these financing numbers from IFC. Now, some of the more recent estimates I have seen coming from different, analysts and market data providers is that in order to achieve this net zero target, the globe needs to be investing something in the order of $5 to $6 trillion per year, okay, between now and 2050 to get there. And where are we against this? So it's not like we haven't gotten started. The world is moving forward on this, but we are in 2022, we touched something like 1.8 trillion dollars of investments against the energy transition. So we have gotten started, but we've still got to multiply this number 3 or 4x, 3 or 4 times to be having any kind of chance to get to net zero. The other metric, again, since Namit and I both come from banking backgrounds, what's the challenge for the banking sector? Now, one of the ways in which, again, analysts look at this is how much is the banking sector financing the energy transition? That means investments in these new clean energy technologies versus the more traditional fossil fuels and carbon intensive sectors. That ratio, again, according to some analysts, needs to get to 4:1. So the average bank at a global level, at an aggregate level, needs to be putting in $4 into clean energy technologies or clean energy transition technologies for every $1 in more traditional fossil fuel or carbon intensive sectors. That number today is barely inching to, yeah, it's a scary number. And we are at somewhere in the less than 1. So that means the banking sector overall is still financing more carbon intensive fossil fuel sectors and is not yet anywhere near there. So all this demonstrates the scale of the challenge which I wanted to lay out. The good news is that, again, as I mentioned, $1.5, $1.8 trillion is no mean achievement for the globe to put against the energy transition. Where does this mostly happen? Largely in 2 sectors. One is in energy, in electricity production. So again, it's kind of quite interesting to note that in the last 2 or 3 years, 80 to 90% of incremental generation, incremental capacity added in electricity generation is happening through renewables and clean energy sectors. So we are really moving the needle on moving away from coal and gas and oil-based thermal electricity production. It's just that the base is very high already, right? The base is still very high. So you have to really bring this curve much faster, trajectory much faster down to shift towards a much cleaner grid, right? So that's, and where is the other sector where we have made a lot of progress? That's in electrification of transport. There, I should mention that India is a very good story, where the 2-wheeler, 3-wheeler sector has really shifted towards electric vehicles. Not so much in terms of 4-wheelers, passenger cars yet, but I think it's coming. That sector has made a lot of progress in countries like China, where today 30-40% of Chinese car sales are actually electric and growing fast. And we are beginning to see the same shift happening in the US and certainly in Europe. And one last thing I'll mention in terms of policy, since this is a policy dialogue. Over the past year to 2 major regions of the world, right? And India, I'll come back to, but 2 major regions which have to contribute a lot to this whole decarbonization effort. One is the US and the other is Europe. Why? Because these are both $20+ trillion economies. And then, of course, China. And they are, in aggregate, have very high emissions. So both of these regions, the US passed this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bit of a misnomer. It has nothing to do with inflation, but it's essentially a climate finance bill where the Biden administration has committed to putting in something like $350 to $400 billion of tax credits, incentives, and subsidies. A lot of carrots, basically, to get the private sector to play ball, to start investing. Europe, on the other hand, has tried this to a stick approach, where they have had a carbon price and a emissions trading system, which actually has a carbon price where many high emitting sectors actually have to pay a price per ton of carbon that they emit. And then EU also has its own subsidy system. Similarly, India, I think, as Namita was mentioning, has come up with a number of different incentive schemes, production-linked incentives, the National Hydrogen Mission. All of these are all moving in that same direction. But again, Anita, coming back to the point that you mentioned right at the beginning, the biggest challenge today is how to get private sector capital flowing at a much larger scale into all these opportunities, because there is no way in which government subsidies or aid or sovereign sort of supported capital is going to achieve the scale that we need. And that's, I think, the single biggest area of policy support that is needed in order to attract large-scale private sector investment. So let me pause there and we can come back for a discussion around these issues.
Yeah, no, really important points. Thank you so much, Monish. when you look from a policy perspective at what India has done, in 2003, India, passed a new law, allowing for registered, for a lot of competition in the power sector, right? So this goes back, 20 years ago. I think the country, in terms of policy, the first National Action Plan in 2008, in 2021, we all remember what happened at, COP26 because of, the clauses that endorse the phasing out of coal. But, since then, at the global stage in global negotiations, we have seen movement towards the issues that countries like India and others in the global south care about, including loss and damage. And now we are a few months away from COP28. So I'd like to shift just a little bit to the COP discussion and then come back to the point, very fundamental point that you made, Monish, about private investment. So Namita, back to you. Looking at COP28, which is not that far away, what are your expectations of what might happen that are going to aid the transition or keep it at this glacial pace?
Yeah, thanks, Anita. I think you brought out the right points, and I'm also linking back to what Monish said. If you look at COP27, loss and damage fund, and to compensate most vulnerable countries for climate-linked damages, I think there's a huge amount of capital that is really required for action, right? So there's a lot of concern, but where is the capital going to come from? And I think one of the areas that we've been seeing is the role of MDBs here, and both of you have been part of multilateral development institutions, and the MDBs have been playing that dual kind of a role where they are being effective agents for integrating development at one level, the climate agendas that have been brought forward, and at the same time providing that additionality, if I may say, to private sector. And there's a huge amount of private capital that needs to come in, the innovations in financial strategies, investments in the global public good. And there's on the other side also a lot of pressure from the emerging markets and developing economies on, demanding finance from under the category of climate finance from the developed nations, right? So I think, there are a couple of things that we require. There is the MDB reforms, which has been a distinct agenda also on the G20's calendar all through. And I think risk sharing and risk mitigation mechanisms, while they are there, the changing role of MDBs is something that needs to be taken cognizance of. And to look at that, how do you come out with instruments, particularly financial instruments, that will draw in private capital and enable greater cross-border mobility of climate finance, private climate finance? I think that needs to be really looked at. So there are market imperfections and risks. But development agencies all across have brought out like blending schemes to fund portfolios of projects in, say, through concessional funding or risk guarantees. I think more and more of such kind of instruments need to look at. So other than credit enhancements, I think, technical assistance, grants to commercialize new carbon reduction technologies, because we're talking about transition here, right? And what is important is to create bankable projects. I think that is the most important thing. So how do you bring in capital to make bankable projects? And what we've also seen is, even in case of the VC space, the venture capitalist space, there is capital that is coming in, and that's like providing that additionality to draw in much of the private capital. So I think that's really how one needs to look at the role of MDBs, the changing role of MDBs that can give comfort to private sector to come in. I would think that that's one of the most important elements of how do we bring in more capital and bring bankable projects. Thank you. Over to you, Anita.
No, thank you, Namita. Interesting. And as you said, bankable projects, I was having this flashback and deja vu because I feel we have been talking about bankable projects for decades. And we've been talking about the need to unlock the potential of blended finance for decades. And yet we have not yet seen the kind of progress in either blended finance, or the ability to really use public finance to catalyze private finance at scale. So Monish, as the representative of that private capital that we want to mobilize, because all of the talk is about how do you get money out of the pension funds? How do you get money out of the institutional investors at scale? Where do you think there are changes so that it doesn't feel like we are like broken records talking about things we've been talking about for decades now?
Yeah, no, it's
How
a very
how
good
do we
question.
go from billions to trillions, in other words?
Indeed. And I do agree with a lot of what Namita said. This is a challenge. Now, on climate and energy transition specifically, there are some ideal policy choices that are out there. And then there is the political side of it, how feasible they are. So, for example, I think most of the audience is probably familiar with this idea of a carbon price or a carbon tax. Because ultimately, private sector acts on pricing signals and on an economic basis, right? However much you put pressure on boards and however much you tell people to go into responsible investing, etc. While of course managements take those issues seriously, but the core of business is to act on commercial principles. And unless there is a price of carbon, why are we emitting so much? Because it's a free global public bad, if you can put it like that, right? I can emit any amount of carbon from my chemical plant or my steel plant. Why should I care if I don't have to pay a price for it? Which is why the policy framework in Europe first focused on building this emissions trading system and a carbon price, where today that price is at almost $100 a ton. So if I'm a steel or a cement manufacturer in Europe, there is an actual cost to the emissions that I am releasing into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, in most parts of the world, that policy action hasn't yet happened, right? India doesn't have a carbon market. China has sort of introduced it, but it's not really meaningful. US, there is no political support for a carbon price or a carbon tax. So unfortunately, the reality of that necessary policy measure to price carbon simply doesn't exist. So where are we then? We are looking at essentially second best solutions, mostly in the form of various incentives or tax credits, right? And why those have to come in is because ultimately the private sector has to make an economic decision. And if the return adjusted for risk is not sufficient for a given project, and Namita said that project is by definition not bankable. And so the only thing you can do is to build in some sort of a support mechanism to de-risk, either reduce the risk on the project by having some sort of government guarantee, or increase the return by having some tax credit or an incentive. Somewhere that risk return has to be reconfigured or rebalanced to make it attractive for a private sector player. And that's fundamentally where we are all really focused on today. Again, the constraints there are fiscal. How much now a US government can put up a $350, $400 billion Inflation Reduction Act commitment. Now, India cannot do that, right? China has been doing this for a very long time, providing a huge amount of incentives. Their objectives are also different. They want to simply scale up and dominate some of the supply chains in these sectors, and they've done it quite successfully. So these are some of the real practical constraints. So hard choices have to be made within available limited budgets. And coming to MDBs, the point that both of you made, the challenge is MDB balance sheets are very limited. They're very small. So the only effective way of using an MDB balance sheets from here, I feel, is to use as much of that capital to de-risk projects rather than financing the entirety of those projects, because then you're wasting precious high-risk capital that is available through sovereign support. And I don't think I think they are looking at it, but they haven't yet pivoted decisively. And you'll remember, Anita, and IFC, we did experiment with this idea of this IDA private sector window, where we carved out a certain portion of sovereign supported capital or donor-based capital for de-risking private sector projects. But it was a successful experiment, but yet very small, right? Not enough by any chance. So again, I don't know how far we will pivot in this direction, but these are some of the challenges that we have to face up to.
No, thank you, Monish, for underscoring the need for perhaps even more policy interventions to support this transition, because, you know, depending on just the MDBs to make the pivot quickly enough and to be able to do it at scale to catalyze private investment cannot be the only solution on the table. And I think when I look at the strategy that India is pursuing, you know, it has to balance a number of different things, because you have the aspirations of a population that is growing, a country that is growing very fast. So the energy demand in the country is pretty insatiable. And so it's actually in some ways extremely bold on India's part as a policy matter to pursue green technology and clean energy while trying to grow. Because when you look at the stories of industrialization and how other countries have grown, very few countries have grown by putting big bets on renewable energy. You know, the growth that has been fueled, if you look at the US and Europe and other countries that are industrialized, this has been fossil fuel-led growth. So to put a bet on growing through renewables is a very bold bet. And it requires an enabling environment, but also letting the market do its job. But I think, you know, we have to say that the market can do so much, but only so much. And then you need more policy. And that is your point, Monish, that maybe we need policy now on carbon pricing and the creation of a carbon market, because without it, all these other things are not going to work fast enough to get us to net zero by 2030. So, Namita, let me turn now to the issue of, you know, something that you have been working on. You've just done a report. Maybe you want to say a few things about the report that Optus just issued recently, the 2 reports you did. When we look at how all of this is working for the people, and you come to the issue of impacts on populations, I want us to think about where are women in this issue? You know, I'm always going to raise a question about gender perspective on any policy issue. So, you know, how are women affected by what is going on? And how do we ensure that women both have a seat at the table in decisions that matter to them, but also do it in a way that is not distortionary? So any insights there?
Thanks, Anita. I think, you know, you've raised a very important question, and the report that we focused on was, you know, how do you look at gender and how do you combine that with just transition and what kind of cover that women require. So it's a very important point. I think when we talk about transition, I think we should not miss out on the fact that the MSME sector, the medium and small enterprises who are a value chain or the supply chain, I think they need to be provided that cover, because there is a segment of women who are in an organized or an unorganized way a part of this whole industry, right? And I think, you know, I will say that coming back to what financial institutions have been doing, or even, you know, if you look at what India is doing, I think, you know, we must give credit that while the financial sector is highly regulated as far as India is concerned, once the country at a country level makes up its mind to move in a particular direction, I think that agility in adoption is phenomenal. I must say that. And we've seen how facilitation through policy measures in the renewable energy sector or in the e-mobility sector has really, you know, moved the industry, and how there are opportunities that have come for not only from a transition standpoint, but also for women or gender as a segment. So that is one point that I want to put out. I think, you know, going back to what are the kind of measures that are required, and look at the kind of financial innovations that need to be brought in, or that are coming in. I think that's very important. So when Monish was speaking, and when you were talking about the facilitation through MDBs, I just want to come back to a very interesting innovation, financial modeling that was recently done. And this was, I think, $150 million deal between one of the large private sector banks and ADB. And this was to provide a partial risk guarantee for MSMEs, to work through the trade, to look at environmental and socially sustainable, kind of supply chains. And I think that these are the kind of things that are very important, because what ADB is doing is it is providing a partial risk guarantee to the bank for lending to its supply chain, with a particular focus on E, S, and G, and S, and the priority sectors where women or gender plays a big role. So when we talk about E, S, and G, the S part is being looked at. And I think, they are providing working capital loans to the MSME sector, which has gender as a part of its participation. I think that is a very important aspect to make note of. Similarly, there are venture capital funds which are looking at focusing on particularly sectors like energy transition, resource management, mobility and supply chains, even sustainable agriculture and food systems for that matter, which has gender at its core. I want to just point out one other element here. When banks or financial institutions look at lending, it is not really, it doesn't really categorize as transition, right? These are general purpose loans. So asset tagging is not really happening. And therefore, there could be a volume of capital that is actually going in this direction unmarked. And I think that is an important point. And, in my banking role, when we looked at our $60 billion balance sheet size, and we actually did the asset tagging, we realized that $11 billion was tagged against priority sector, ESG, sustainable finance, whatever we want to call it, but that kind of tagging. So I think, some measures like asset tagging becomes very, very important. And, you've seen how sustainability linked loans or sustainability linked bonds have provided a kind of a, delivery where it's KPI linked. So what happens is that for companies also in India, which are looking to, which are looking to get more and more capital from banks towards some of the transition, agenda that it has, it provides a kind of a flexibility to integrate the general corporate purpose into the sustainability interventions and enhance the accountability of the sectors to be able to tap into the green finance or whatever you call it. I think that's very, very, that's critical now when we're talking about transition, and somewhere it percolates down to the women, because women are at the core of transition, and we say that, and we've seen that as a part of our reports. I think one last point that I want to make is there are many products that are being developed by individual financial institutions. Some kind of standardization has been brought out by, say, the regulators. For example, bringing, when we're talking about green retail deposits. So, all of us have done a lot of wholesale kind of products where there is green elements to it, right? But I think one of the first things that we went out way back in 2017, 2017-18, when we issued the green retail deposit. And I think that those kind of retail products are bringing in more recognition or at least more sensitivity towards what is happening as far as climate or transition is concerned. And with the regulatory guideline that now RBI has brought in, I think it has created a kind of a level playing field and an encouragement to issue these kind of products, which not only look at de-risking facilities, to attract private kind of sector finance, but also without any kind of de-risking, how do you look at products that will particularly, or proactively, if I may say, look at those sectors that are either transitioning or green or clean. I think that is the larger point that I want to make here. Thank you. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Namita, and thank you for emphasizing the need for and the emphasis on product development as part of the toolbox. I'm going to ask Priyanka to take a look and see if there are any questions from our audience, but let me go back to you, Monish, in the meantime. And I'm going to ask you about a 4-letter word. And that 4-letter word is coal. And it's a controversial word because, in many parts of the world, you are now seeing a push to say absolutely no coal. Now, but for a country like India, this is a difficult thing to do because, while we are pushing in India for the renewable sector to become even bigger, there is still a huge dependence on coal. Any views on that? Where should India be on this spectrum of coal, no coal?
So this is probably one of the trickiest challenges, certainly in India, but in countries like Indonesia, China, and some other places as well, because I think everybody recognizes that ultimately the sooner we give up coal in favor of cleaner energy sources, the better it is for the world at large and even for the countries. The challenge, of course, is that in countries like India, there is so much tied to coal. So first of all, it's for a country like India, it's our cheapest energy source, right? Because all the other alternatives, the imports of oil and gas, we pay a huge amount of money, in foreign exchange. And renewables, while it has picked up very well, India's efforts on solar and wind are actually quite commendable, but it's still limited. And of course, there is a whole bigger social challenge. There is so much of our labor, our regional economies of important, significant parts of the country tied to coal. How are you going to disentangle all that? You can't do it overnight. And this is one area certainly which needs, not only Indian government policy, but this is one area where we should negotiate hard for much more support from MDBs as well as from developed countries. Now, I know that I think there is some negotiation going on similar to the policy packages that were recently approved by G7 countries for South Africa and Indonesia, and I think Vietnam as well, where each of these countries have been given multi-billion-dollar packages, 7, 10, $15 billion packages pulled together by G7 donors, in effect to support this transition away from coal. So what this money is intended to do is to bring forward the shutdown of coal plants much ahead of what their normal life would be, and also pay for rehabilitation, transition of the populations and workers affected. But this is going to be a tough task because there is it's a much bigger space and this money may not be enough. So any kind of creative ideas here that can be deployed need to be brought in. But that's I think a reality that we have to face up to. We have to transition away from it.
Namita, your thoughts on coal?
Well, I would say that it is something that will stay for a bit. And I think what is very important is how do you balance climate change or climate action with sustainability and economic growth? I think that is really the question. And we've seen, you mentioned about the whole climate crisis that we've seen over the last 1.5 years or 2 years. It has become a financial crisis. It has been impacting lives of people, and there are across the world coal which had stopped maybe in pockets has been started because the alternative fuel that we are supplying is not adequate enough to be able to meet the needs against the kind of climate incidences that are happening. I think that's an important point to be looked at. I think there's a larger point that I want to make here when we look at coal and its transition or transition as a whole. I think it's very important to understand that transition is not really simple and easy. It's complex. It's multifaceted. It faces barriers. Financial institutions have limited engagement as far as climate sectors are concerned, in which in itself the whole topic becomes very, very tricky. And on top of that, granularizing conventional sectors with a transition lens that presents a significant obstacle. Look at today. It's very, we all will relate to this. Traditional risks and the types of risks that traditional sectors face, these are very well known. There are algorithms, there is the algorithms or the mathematics around the ROI, the whole tenors, the risks that are involved. But when we talk about newer sectors, I mean, today we are talking about green hydrogen, right? I mean, it's a very new complex subject that we are talking about. And while we are saying that, okay, maybe in India, green hydrogen needs 3 trillion INR, have we taken into account the production of renewable energy for producing green hydrogen, and the cost or the kind of capital that is required to be able to look at that? So I think the larger point is that it is a very, very complex subject, and the mandate of credit and risk officers is to concentrate on mainstream risks like credit, liquidity, systemic, operational. Hence, the additionality to apply climate risks to traditional risk types in a bank is this is neither a mandate nor a requirement currently. So, taking a target and like Monish said earlier on, financial institutions are here to do commercial business. And I mean, I may sound bad by saying this, but that's a fact, right? And therefore, now to bring in climate, if there is an opportunity, yes, I mean, absolutely, there are institutions that look at it as an opportunity. I mean, today renewable energy has become a mainstream sector because the risks are understood, the opportunities are there,
and you can make money, and you can make money.
You can make money. I mean, look at green bonds, right? In India, when India issued the sovereign green bond, it did get a greenium, and that makes a lot of sense. But if a green bond against a conventional bond is not going to get additionality, then why would financial institutions or even companies go behind it? When we talk to bankers today, we do a lot of interactions with bankers across India because we work on a UK government project and other things. What is asked is, what is the incentive to go behind climate sectors? Is there a regulatory mandate right now? Is there a regulatory mandate to say, no, we are not going to finance coal? So I think, we need to not look at coal in isolation, but it's important to look at these kind of sectors in totality. In the life cycle, one of the growth, the economic growth of a country, I would say, and also taking into consideration, India is going to peak by 2050. So naturally, it is going to, until 2050, it will emit and it will use whatever it has to its, whatever is available to be able to deliver on that economic growth. So I think that's really the perspective. While I'm very sensitive to the fact that coal does, it should get phased out and it should go out, but we need stronger alternatives. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Namita. We're coming close to the end of our discussion. So I checked with Priyanka. There are no questions from the audience. So I'm actually going to ask a question. I've been doing that all along, but let me just ask a closing question to each of you. So, if you put yourself in the shoes of a young person today, because many of the people who are studying at Kautilya are young, and they are thinking about careers in public policy. They're thinking about, what are the areas we should be working on? Some of them have a natural interest in climate related issues. It's pretty depressing when you think about what the future holds, because all of the projections show that we are not on track for the 1.5. You know, countries like India, who matter so much for global emissions now, can have to, for the reasons both of you have explained, to continue to use coal, which means to continue to emit. And at the same time, we have very, very stark physical reminders of the impending, you know, some would call it a crisis, some might call it a catastrophe. The kind of heat that we experienced, the world experienced in July, is unprecedented, but it is something that we should expect to become the norm going forward. So if I'm a young person thinking about the future, I'm looking at a pretty bleak future. Is there anything in this scenario, Monish, that gives hope?
So it's a very interesting question, Anita, and especially seen from a young person's lens today at Kautilya or other similar institutions starting out in their careers. So on the one hand, clearly the scale of the challenge is huge and it could, you know, get us down a little bit, sound depressing. But the flip side of it is that it's also a tremendous opportunity. What I'm saying here is that a number of ideas, innovations, both on the policy side, as well as on the more practical technology side, financing side, transaction side, many of these innovations are out there for young people to kind of work on, right? It's a huge career opportunity today to get involved in this space, because there are very, very few things that are certain, you know, in this world. And one of those certainties is that we are you know, warming at an alarming rate. The globe is warming at an alarming rate. It's already creating, as you said, Anita, very erratic weather patterns, wildfires and whatnot. So we know this is a present and imminent threat. So what more level of certainty could there be for our young people with bright ideas, with technical skills, with knowledge of policy, to get fully involved in this space and think big? Think big. This is a problem that has to be solved not just for India, but for the globe. So any business model that you think about, any innovation that you talk about, any startup idea that you have, India is like brimming with, you know, with young people full of ideas. If I see the whole startup environment in India, it's a dramatic change from when, you know, I grew up or I worked in my early career in India. There's so many young Indians with a startup dream in their mind. Today, this whole clean tech space is out there for new ideas and innovations and cutting edge breakthroughs to be discovered. Why? There's absolutely no reason why this has to be left to only entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley or US or in China. India should be at the heart of this. So I would say, look at it positively. It's a huge challenge and we need every bit of our young people's energy, ideas and ambition to get behind this. So I guess our generation is handing over a huge challenge and an opportunity for the you know, young generation of you know, folks at places like Kautilya. So I would say think positive and think big.
Thank you, Monish, for those uplifting words. Final words from you, Namita.
I echo what Monish has said. I think one thing I would like to put forth is, unlike my generation, today's youth is not only vocal, but there's a realization, there's concern, and there's action. So I think that's the good part, right? When we started working on these issues, maybe a couple of decades ago, we were the only people who were working on it. And, you know, it was very lonely. So I'm glad that today it's becoming a movement. So I think that is very, very critical. I absolutely agree when Monish said about scale. Given the sheer quantum of the challenge that we are facing today, I think scalability and sustainability of models become super critical. And I think one of the last points that I want to make is, I always believed in influencing, because I started as a public policy. My career has started as public policy. I've worked on taxation and I've worked on, you know, manufacturing industry related laws and whatnot. But I think what is most important is influencing through policy can achieve a lot of action on ground. And I would really be a big supporter of that. There's a huge opportunity. for today's individuals as young people, as Monish said, bright minds, consider, influencing policy into getting into policy roles. I think that will be able to deliver a lot of actions. On one side, there are young people who are developing these innovative models, innovative financing, using digitalization, fintech, leveraging that. On the other side, I think influencing policy becomes extremely important. So consider those kind of roles today, which would help overall. So it's really about the power of the collective, the power of the institution, and the power of one. I would end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for ending on this optimistic, upbeat note. I think this is what young people need to hear. This discussion of ours will be shared with the students at Kautilya. Several joined today, and I know there are many more online who are not visible in the attendee list. But thank you so much, both of you, for a very rich and fruitful discussion. And to the students at Kautilya who are watching, please be encouraged by what you have heard. And please do, as Monish and Namita suggested, think big, think positively, and contribute. We, the elders, look forward to your contributions to solving one of the greatest existential global challenges of our time, but with a sense of opportunity, optimism, and hope. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next month for the next Let's Talk Policy. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Anita.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Anita.